Hello and a warm welcome to the Sammy Miller Museum in Hampshire, the venue for this week's edition of the show, which sees two bike owners of two iconic bikes competing for the title of Top Dog. Now, when it comes to bikes, we've all got our particular favourites, but some people are positively bonkers about one particular make or model, and we've got them all here on Top Dog. We've also got a panel of experts whose job it is to pull apart the argument of the owners that theirs is the best bike in its class. More about them in a moment, but first it's time to meet our first owner, who truly believes that his bike is the dog's.
My name's Graham Jackson, and the bike is a 1968 BSA Rocket 3. It's the second one I've owned, and I just love it. It is everything that the British motorcycle industry could have been. Oh, it's 750 cc's, 3-cylinder. It's got a 4-speed gearbox. It's got a twin leading shoe front brake, 3 carburetors, one carburetor to each cylinder, which makes its main fault, or its only fault really, is the fact it does like to consume petrol at around about 40 to the gallon, and if you're really thrashing it, it'll go down to the mid-30s. I love this bike because of the sound, and I love this bike because the racing version, the BSA Rocket 3, was a world beater. Well, you have to hear it really to know what I mean. It's just, you fall in love with the sound.
And with me now is Graham Jackson with his pride and joy, the BSA Rocket 3. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
We'll be speaking to you a little bit later, but it's now time to introduce our panel of experts whose job it is to pull apart the good and bad arguments as to whether this or the other bike is the top dog. First of all, we have James Robinson, the editor of Classic Motorcycle magazine. Alongside him, Steve Wilson, a journalist and expert in post-war British bikes. And finally, Evan Cosmo, who restores classic bikes and has his own company, Cosmo Motorcycles. So let's get straight to the debate. Evan, what are your thoughts on this classic British bike?
Absolute superb looking bike, but we're getting towards the end of the 60s, early 70s, and looking at it, it's still lost in the 50s really. It's something out of Dan Dare. Although I love these bikes, and my heart, it just looks superb. But the exhaust, the covers on the oil coolers and that, it's lost in the 50s really. It's going to be left behind.
I don't know, this was styled by Ogle, whose big credit was Reliant three-wheeler cars. Arguably the styling is the worst feature about it. As a motorcycle, it's superb.
Yeah, I'd need to come in there. I think the styling was the big problem with it when it was introduced. I mean, it didn't appeal to a lot of people.
Slab-sided.
That's it.
And it couldn't decide whether it was a dray horse or a rocket ship, as you say.
Yeah, it is, yeah. It's 50.
Cosmo made a good point, competition, and competition was getting fierce by the time this came out.
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. You've got to take it into a context of what was coming on the market at the time that the BSA Triumph Group introduced these triples.
The Japanese were just about to assault the big capacity market.
And from what they were coming in with, I mean, there'd been a warning a few years earlier as Honda particularly had got more high tech in their smaller machines, and it was widely known that they were going to bring something out soon that was going to be high tech and something different. So BSA Triumph had to do something, and this was their machine.
And what they did essentially was stick one extra cylinder onto their very successful twins.
Where does this fit in the classic range of BSAs that went through the years?
I mean, it was the last new model that came out bearing a BSA name, so it's quite important in that respect. Although it also, obviously, it borrows a lot from the Triumph. I mean, because by then BSA and Triumph were one and the same company. So this machine and the Triumph Trident, its kind of sister, are very, very similar. But it was, it stands out in there. It was the last new BSA ever, basically. And in a long and illustrious line, it means it's a pretty important thing.
And it had its own identity in that the cylinders were tilted forward 15 degrees, and which made it distinct from the Triumph version, the Trident, let alone the styling, which is completely its own thing.
Absolutely stonky motor. Internally, all the triples are very similar.
Yeah.
Obviously, it does share different crankcases. It hasn't got the upright cylinders,
But both versions won races, big races at Daytona.
For
and
what was
elsewhere.
basically an outdated, even when it was introduced, as an
I-
outdated
I-
push
design.
rod model.
A lot of people refer to these as a speed twin and a half, but once you've actually worked on the engines and stripped them down, it is completely different, really. It's a one-piece crankshaft. It's got a diaphragm clutch on it.
That crankshaft you
yeah.
mentioned was forged in the BSA forge, which they still had, so they couldn't build enough of them to make money out of. Unfortunately, that was a limiting factor commercially. The whole engine took 56 operations to build and put together.
But
Time consuming.
still stonking engine. When they used
Absolutely,
to
good
race
result.
these in the Rob North frames and that, the racers used to actually touch 170 miles an hour. But they weren't production bikes, they were out racers.
All right, hold it there, gents. We'll have a little bit more debate in a moment, but now it's time to see the Rocket 3 in action. We set the cameras out with Graham to see how it got on. I have to admit, it looked good out there with Graham on the Bruntingthorpe track. But let's go back to our panellists. You've seen it in action now. Any more thoughts? First of all, Cosmo.
Styling again, unfortunately, as I said before, it's a lovely looking bike, but it looks like something out of the 50s, and we're talking very late 60s, 70s is just round the corner, and even the name Rocket 3s, it's just 50s styling. I think it's a little bit too little, way too late, unfortunately, for the BSA factory.
Not a bike for the future.
Well, that was the idea, wasn't it? That it was going to be the bike for the future.
If you're in the 50s, yeah. Even though,
I take slight issue with you pointing, like saying that the styling looks very 50s. I know it does, but I think that was an intentional thing that they tried to do to make it look distinct from the bikes they've been producing. I don't know how successful it was really, because it does look like you say, inspired.
And there's an indication the way things could have gone is the Hurricane.
Absolutely.
Which took a Rocket 3 as its basis and was the first factory custom, absolutely great bike. But this, sadly, a bit too lumpen, despite
the fact development, really, didn't it?
I would have said
before production.
Yeah, but they didn't have the time because the other thing was waiting in the wings.
All right, gents, time for the talking is over. It's now time for the facts. The BSA Rocket 3, the years of production were 1968 to 1972. It was a four-stroke overhead valve, three-cylinder engine, 750 cc's, putting out a brake horsepower of 58. Top speed was about 125 miles per hour, and its current value, £5,000. Well, Graham, now it's your chance to get your final plea across to the panel as to why you think this bike is the dog's.
Well, basically, it's the sound, the noise. Anybody who was at Mallory Park in 1971 and heard John Cooper beat Giacomo Agostini on a Rocket 3 will remember the sound, the noise, the glory of the bike. This bike represents the greatest achievements of a British racing motorcycle, production racing motorcycle, has ever made. And he repeated it the following week at Brands Hatch. And even Agostini himself said that he couldn't catch Cooper on the Rocket 3. And that was what sold it to me. And it continues to sell it to me because every time I ride it, I hear that noise. Every time I ride it, I'm John Cooper.
Well, that's not a bad argument, guys. It's one thing we haven't really mentioned, the noise and the nostalgia that brings out in terms of the memories. We're talking classics here. Cosmo.
I totally agree. The sound, on full chat, they just absolutely howl.
It's the wail.
You can hear a Trident a mile off, and you know it's a triple. They just sound awesome on the end, you know.
And Steve, it frightened Agostini, come on.
It certainly did, yes. It was not the first time either. And these rocket-type ray gun exhaust pipes, that's it, are the ones. Better than the later, more restrictive things that were fitted.
The big cigar ones on the later ones, on the Tridents and that.
Not a patch.
But it sounds awesome.
Yeah.
What I like about this model is, being a BSA, it's got the duplex cradle frame. which the Triumph didn't have, unfortunately. It just had a standard cradle frame.
Bolted up frame. Yeah.
The BSA, we talked about similarities between the Triumph triples. It's all very similar, virtually the same bike.
But we feel the BSA had the edge.
Yeah,
And of course the BSA went first, didn't it, as well?
Yes.
It was the Trident kept in production for longer than the arguably better BSA.
But
like
the
I said,
T160, the later Trident took that tilted engine. Yeah.
And of course the Hurricane as well, like we spoke about earlier, was more BSA than
yes,
Triumph.
it's the BSA frame as well.
That's right.
Well, thanks, guys. But let me get back to its top dog potential. The CB750 coming up. Steve, what about its potential?
The charm of the end of an era, and it's a hell of a bike.
Even though it still retains push rods, it is multi-cylinder. It's a 3-cylinder with a stonking engine.
That's it, a lot of good points for it, but when you take it in context of the competition of the time, it's just probably 5 years too late.
Thanks, guys. Well, interesting stuff, I think you'll agree. And will they change their minds when they've heard from our next owner? Because he believes that his bike really is the dog's.
The Honda CB750 is my bike of choice to go from here to Timbuktu without breaking down, and I can't think of another bike that would do that that was made before this. That's why I think it's top dog.
Which bike gets christened the dogs? Find out when we come back. Welcome back. Now, as we've seen already, if you believe that your bike really is the top dog, you'll do whatever it takes to convince the skeptics that yours really is the best in its class. And I have to say, Graham did a pretty good job with his references to Agostini and that beautiful sound of the Rocket. But the man next to me, John Wyatt from North Yorkshire, doesn't believe a word of it. Nope, he believes that his bike, the CB750 Honda, really is the dog's.
Hello, my name is John Wyatt and this is a Honda CB750. When it first came out, people said it didn't handle very well, but I noticed all the people that said that all ended up having one by the time 1976 had rolled around. It's a 1970 model CB750, early version. It was the first real production bike with a disc brake. It's 750 cc's, 4 cylinders, 4 exhausts. Quite an exotic machine for its day. I love this bike basically because it's such a good all-rounder. It'll do everything you want it to do, and it'll get you where you want to go. Plus, I think it looks absolutely marvellous. The colours were great. There's plenty of chrome on it and steel, no plastic really. And I think it's pretty much the epitome of modern-day classic motorcycle.
Well, John's here with us now with his CB750, and you saw Graham in action, of course, with the panel. What are your thoughts? Do you think you can handle the competition?
Certainly. No trouble at all.
Fair enough. Well, let's turn to our panellists. First of all, Steve, when this bike was launched, it was said to be an engineering, production and marketplace landmark. Would you agree?
Afraid I have to. I say I'm afraid because this represents the enemy to any British bike lover. It arguably was something that swept the whole industry away. But it's hard not to be impressed. Disc brake at the front, electric starter, engine that was built with horizontally split crankcases so that oil didn't leak out. Ah, yes.
And James, the first real superbike?
Well, I mean, arguably so. It was things like the overhead camshaft engine that you've got in the CB750 until then had been restricted to the racetrack, basically, apart from the little Hondas, you know, the smaller Hondas. And it was the first big capacity, you know, with the technology then compared to what the competition was, it was arguably the first.
Exactly, it's not just
120 straight out.
yeah,
Great.
and it's the little things like you actually got indicators and
That
you know,
worked.
again 4-cylinder, you know, it's a true multi. The gearbox, 5-gear speed, you get a free gear, 5-speed gearbox, which is pressure fed, not just splash fed. And you know, we like British bikes, but engineering, you just can't fault the engineering.
Again,
on
the
it.
details, yeah, the switchgear, for instance, like British switchgear, very hit and miss, vulnerable to the wet, so on. Look at that. way to go.
I think what's also important to remember is when this went on sale in America at the same time as like the Rocket 3, this significantly undercut the price as well. So you got all of this, all of these features.
Assault,
so it was a planned commercial assault.
Yeah, you mentioned the disc brake, but I think it's the first hydraulic disc brake on a production bike, if I'm correct.
So.
You know, what can you say? Engineering terms, you know.
We'll have more from you in a moment, thanks guys, and we'll also hear, of course, what John has to say about the bike that he's so mad about. Now we want your comments on the Honda CB750 or any of the other bikes in the series. All you have to do is log on to our website, which is menandmotors.co.uk. You can also tell us what bikes you think should be on the show, and maybe you've got an iconic bike yourself. Let us know if you think we should see it. But let's get back to the debate, and it's interesting this because this was the beginning of a new era. Honda now dominate both racing and probably the marketplace in many ways. Was this, Cosmo, the first bike to do it?
I feel it was. My heart, British bikes are what you call classic bikes. And a lot of people, you know, say this is Imposter or Honda. But in terms of engineering, it is excellent. You know, excellence is probably a way to...
Imposter or the future, Steve?
And it took a chance. There were no across-the-frame four-cylinder bikes at the time outside the racetrack. So commercially, it took a big chance. It was much, much wider than bikes previously were.
It's a big bike, isn't it? It's tall.
It was heavier, it was relatively tall. It could have gone down, you know, it could have been not a success. It looks inevitable in hindsight, but it wasn't at the time.
But, I mean, I think this is probably the bike that the term superbike was actually derived from, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, arguably it was. And like we were sort of mentioning earlier, it was things that until then had really only been on the racetrack. Which were now available to the man in the street, but also in a refined way as well.
But it wasn't flawless by any manner of means.
Absolutely
it didn't go around corners too well. Partly that was due to the tyre technology of the time, but partly to the fact it's a big heavy bike.
Let me hold you there, guys. We'll have another debate as to whether this really is the dogs in a moment, but we sent the cameras out with John to take a look at the Honda in action. Well, there was the Honda in action in the careful hands of John there, looking pretty good. Back to our panellists, though, now. Obviously, we've discussed the fact that it was quite a revolutionary bike, but what about its performance? First of all, Cosmo.
Performance, it's obviously very good. It's nearly, if not 9 brake horsepower up on the Rocket 3. But then the Rocket 3 top speeds are about the same due to the weight of this monster. It is a big bike.
But this did pick up better from low down than the Rocket 3, which made it more enjoyable.
Due to engine design.
And especially like in the European market, people are more used to having lighter, better handling bikes rather than big engines and higher performance. So it was a bit of a shock to some, I should imagine, you know, because it's more about, rather than the kind of European nimble light-to-weight, it's
big bike.
Yeah, it's a big bike.
US highways.
For big miles, isn't it? Really, that's.
How accepting were Europeans, especially the British, to what would be, like you say, the onslaught of the Japanese?
Term jack crap, rice burner, things like that. But obviously the public bought them in their droves. You know, they did buy them.
It was a break boundary. It definitely was. You know, some of us didn't buy them, and got stuck basically in a flowered rut, which is the classic ghetto. But
the performance
people who actually enjoyed riding went that way.
Yeah, saying about performance, the performance is good. It is up to the Rocket 3, up to that standard.
Let me hold you there. That's the talk. Let's get down to the facts. The Honda CB750 was produced between 1969 and 1978. It's a 4-stroke overhead cam 4-cylinder engine, 750 cc's, putting out a brake horsepower of 67 with a top speed of 125 miles per hour. Current value £5,500. And John, you've heard the panellists, and of course you've heard what they've said about the rocket as well. It's your last chance now to make a plea as to why the CB750 is the dogs.
Well, personally, I think it followed on from the Rocket 3. This was the new era. It coined the name Superbike, and it is a superbike. You can still use it today in today's traffic conditions. The brakes work well, all that sort of stuff. You can ride it round town a lot easier than you could a Rocket 3. They sold nearly 500,000 of them, so they've kind of been wrong, really.
Thanks, John. A pretty good plea. 500,000 sold. Top dog potential. First of all, James.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, everything John says is true, and especially the bit about it's possibly the next step on from like the Rocket 3. It was that kind of significant. All of the features that came out on it were what are sort of now still in the mainstream, you know, like the 4-cylinder and all this kind of thing became the new mainstream, which I think is something, you know, it was the new thing.
What would be a letdown for a lot of people, it's a Honda, you know, but obviously engineers would not, they'd look at the bike as a package, not the badge. And it's a, you know, engineering terms, it's a top bike, the whole
No
package.
question, yeah. But they only built 6,700 Rocket 3s, so I think it deserves to be cherished.
And you know, the CB750 range was near 1 million, wasn't it?
Yeah, 1 million with all the variants, I think. Yeah.
So 1 million people can't really be wrong, can they?
It's a fair comment, but now it's decision time for our panel. You've talked to the owners, you've seen the bikes in action. Now, which one really is the top dog?
It's a tough one. They were both on sale virtually at the same time, but they're from different eras.
I mean, yeah, I think that's basically, yeah, that's the main point to make.
It's not just the indicators or the disc brake, it's the whole package, isn't it?
It is,
It's
yeah.
the whole bike.
Yeah, I mean,
it was thought through.
if you want more of a classic experience, maybe the BSA is the one to go for, because the Honda is that stage on, it's more of a modern thing.
This is miles ahead, isn't it? This is looking forward, and unfortunately this is looking back in time.
Top dog is what we're after.
Well, that's it. So then you have to say, in your sensible mind, that you've got to go for the Honda.
Yeah.
Are we all agreed?
Yes, definitely.
Right then, Cosmo, on behalf of the panellists, tell us which of these two bikes is the dogs.
It's a very close decision and a split decision. Has to go to John and the Honda.
Ooh,
If you
congratulations.
could present that
Well,
to John, please.
unlucky Graham, and well done, John. A split decision, so the panel really fighting there.
I never had any doubts, Jonathan, to be honest with you.
And you're well pleased with the black.
Very nice.
Graham, disappointed, but hey, what can you say?
What can you say? Never mind. We live to fight another day.
Live to fight another day, and the sound of the BSA, I'm sure, will continue. My thanks to both the owners and, of course, to our panellists and to everybody at the Sammy Miller Museum. We'll be back next time with 2 more iconic bikes to compete and find out which one really is top dog. See you soon.